Today, the Unemployment Conundrum. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, where I've noticed post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Well, the ABS released their labour statistics data today, and it came in line ball with last month, so not as strong as economists were expecting. That said, the labour market is tight because external labour supply from temporary workers and migration has stalled thanks to the pandemic. And by the way, that's the reason why unemployment rates in many Western countries are considerably below where they were previously. It's not really government policy, it's more to do with the migration factor. And of course, as migration is wound up, things might get a bit different. Essentially, in Australia, the supply has dropped by around 500,000 workers. So this is hardly great economic management. And if migration is powered up again, the unemployment rate will rise. Now, the latest official projections are for a fall to 3 point something and then a subsequent reversal as migration kicks in. And do remember this, the threshold is an hour worked to qualify as employed. The seasonally adjusted unemployment rate remained at 4% in March 2022, according to the ABS. And they said with employment increasing by 18,000 people and unemployment falling by 12,000 people, the unemployment rate decreased slightly in March, though remained at 4.0% in rounded terms. 4.0% is the lowest the unemployment rate has been in the monthly surveys. Lower rates were seen in the series before November 1974, when the survey was quarterly. The unemployment rate continued to fall faster for women than for men. And for women, it fell from 3.8 to 3.7%. That's the lowest it's been since May 1974. And it remained at 4.2% for men. That's the second lowest level since November 2008, and just above the rate from December 2021 of 4.1%. Employment increased for the fifth month in a row by around 18,000 people, 0.1%, in March, and it was around 220,000 people, or 1.7% higher than the pre-Delta period high of June 2021. Employment for youth, those aged between 15 and 24 years, increased by 36,000 in March 2020. While young people were particularly impacted early in the pandemic and during the Delta period, we've continued to see strong increases in youth employment over the past year. The youth employment to population ratio in March was the highest it had been since August 2008 at 64.8% and 4.6 percentage points higher than the start of the pandemic, the ABS has said. With floods in New South Wales and Queensland, a higher than usual number of people reported working reduced hours due to bad weather in March. That was in addition to the high number of people away from work due to illness, reflecting further disruption from the Omicron variant. In fact, flooding in New South Wales and Queensland in late February 2022 resulted in a major disruption to the operation of the labour force survey. So as a result, there was lower than usual number of responding households in some of the affected regions in March 2022. Given the severity of those disruptions, and to ensure that that loss of sample didn't affect the data for Australia, New South Wales and Queensland, the ABS imputed some samples within 15 statistical area, that's the SA4 levels, for March 2022. This imputation approach drew upon previous information that had recently been collected from people in the affected areas following the approach used for February 2019 for the Townsville floods. For March 2022, the ABS also used some hours-related information for populations in affected areas and adjacent areas to account for the impact on hours worked, which is where labour market impacts from floods, bushfires and cyclones are generally observed, more than changes in employment or unemployment. For March 2022, 2.9% of the sample was imputed using this approach, 5.6% of the sample in New South Wales and 9.2% of the sample in Queensland. This imputational approach will be reassessed once April data has been collected from the affected areas. For the Townsville floods, the ABS reassessed the imputation approach used for February 2019 and the following month and confirmed that revisions were not required. Data for these SA4 areas for March 2022 won't be published in the Labour Force Australia series, and the ABIS expects to resume publishing those estimates with the release of the April data in May 2022. So that means we need to be cautious about some of the data in New South Wales and Queensland between February and March, given the effect of the imputation in those two states. The fall in hours in March follows falls in payroll jobs and wages over the same period. Like hours, that data can show larger short-term changes than for employment because employees may be away from paid work for a short period without losing their job. Now back to the main data, the participation rate remained at 66.4% in rounded terms, around the record high of February 2022. The underemployment rate fell 0.2 percentage points to 6.3%, and that was 2.5 percentage points lower than its March 2020 level at 8.8%, and the lowest it's been since November 2008. The underutilisation rate, which combines the unemployment and the underemployment rates, dropped 0.3 percentage points to 10.3%. That was 3.8 percentage points lower than its March 2020 level at 14.1%, and the lowest level since September 2008. Across the states, the unemployment rate was lowest at 3.4% in WA and the ACT, followed by 3.9% in New South Wales, 4% in Victoria and Queensland, 4.1% in the Northern Territories, 4.5% in Tasmania and 4.9% in South Australia. Underemployment was lowest in the ACT at 4.1%, followed by the Northern Territories at 5.1%, then Victoria at 5.7%, New South Wales at 6.1%, Tasmania and Western Australia at 6.7%, Queensland at 7%, and South Australia at 7.7%. And finally, the participation rate is lowest in Tasmania at 60.9%, followed by South Australia at 63.5%, New South Wales at 65%, Queensland at 66%, Victoria at 67%, Western Australia at 69.7%, the ACT at 71.2%, and the Northern Territory at 71.9%. Now, it is worth noting that the alternative data from Roy Morgan revealed unemployment fell another 0.7%, but to 7.8%. That's the lowest since October 2019. But underemployment rose by 0.6% to 8.4%. Now, looking at the detail, unemployment fell 94,000 to 1.13 million Australians, or 7.8% of the workforce in March, while underemployment increased 93,000 to 1.22 million, or 8.4% of the workforce. Overall, unemployment and underemployment was virtually unchanged at 2.36 million people. Workforce increased 80,000 in March as employers hired more workers, and the workforce in March was 14,523,000, up 80,000 from February, comprising of 30,390,000 employed Australians, up 174,000, and 1.133 million unemployed Australians looking for work, down 94,000. Employment increases was driven by an increase in part-time employment, and Australian employment increased by 124,000 to 13.39 million people in March, driven by an increase in part-time employment, up 289,000 to 4.712 million. However, full-time employment decreased by 115,000 to 8.678 million. Unemployment was down in March and is well down on a year ago. 1.133 million Australians were unemployed, that's 7.8% of the workforce, a decrease of 94,000 from February, with fewer people looking for full-time work, down 76,000 to 387,000, and also fewer people looking for part-time work, down 18,000 to 746,000. Underemployment was up in March as part-time employment increased. In addition to the unemployed, 1.22 million Australians, or 8.4% of the workforce, were underemployed, working part-time but looking for more work. That's an increase of 93,000, up 0.6% from February. When part-time employment increases, up 289,000 in March, underemployment usually increases as well, as more people working part-time leads to more people wanting to work more hours. Compared to early March 2020, before the nationwide lockdown, in March 2022, there was almost 200,000 more Australians either unemployed or underemployed, up 0.6 percentage points, even though overall employment was over 500,000 higher than it was pre-COVID-19. Separately, job advertising data from Seek shows that March was a record-breaking month, with the highest number of jobs on Seek's 25-year history. In particular, job ads rose 5% month over month and was up 32.2% year over year, and were also 50.7% higher than March 2019. Applications per job ad also decreased by 4.5%. According to Kendra Banks, managing director at Seek, last month, once again, we had the most job ads on site in Seek's 25-year history. If that sounds familiar, it's because this has been true every month this year, with January, February, and now March, each lodging record job ad numbers. This makes for an increasingly tight job market, and while interest among candidates remains consistent, as indicated by candidates' visits to site staying strong, the low levels of application per ad, which fell a further 4.5%, are not matching the persistent demand for talent. So, standing back, there are some good numbers here superficially, but when you come to understand why they are occurring, it's more serendipitous than planned. And opening up migration will, of course, turn the tide, and it will also potentially weaken any prospective wages recovery. This is what happened in the decade leading up to the pandemic, when Australia added 2 million jobs, but the nation's unemployment rate only fell by 0.5%. So basically, most of those new jobs created went to migrants imported into Australia. Now that's worth considering in the middle of the current election campaigns. But then, of course, there are so many vested interests driving big Australia. More people to sell property to, more people to work for peanuts, and more people to lend more money to, as well as more to consume more, never mind the congestion. Thus, we can expect unemployment and wages growth to lose momentum, and the reason, well, just to make big Australia bigger. And I have to say that below the surface here, these trends are really quite worrying, but they're also consistent with other countries around the world. To extent, therefore, quoting the unemployment rate and using that to determine policy seems to me very fraught. It's convenient, particularly in an election campaign, but sometimes the truth is masked rather than revealed by these numbers. Now, if you're buying your home in Sydney's contentious market, you don't need to stand alone. This is the time you need to have Edwin Almeida from Ribbon Property Consultants standing alongside you. Buying a property is both challenging and adversarial. The vendor has a professional on their side. Emotions run high, price discovery and price transparency are hard to find, and then there's the wasted time and financial investments that you make. Edwin understands your needs, so why not engage a licensed professional to stand alongside you? With RPC, you know you have experience, knowledge, and master negotiators looking after your best interests. So shoot Ribbon an email at info@ribbonproperty.com.au, and if you use the promo code DFAWTW/Martin, you can get a 10% discount offer. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.